So Brian Elfick, we're really delighted to have you here as our speaker. Brian studied PPE, so politics, philosophy and economics at Oxford, and then he studied theology here in Cambridge, and he's now working for a church in Liverpool. So thank you so much, Brian. Over to you.
Well, it's very nice to be here. Thank you very much. Okay, Colin Kaepernick is an NFL quarterback who last year wanted to highlight that Black Lives Matter, so he chose to kneel during the national anthem. Now no one will employ him, interestingly. Asma Mahfouz is an Egyptian vlogger widely credited with sparking the Arab Spring with the videos that she filmed. In 2011, she won the Sakharov Prize for freedom of thought. It's not clear whether she can leave her country now. Arvida Bistrom is a model and an artist, famous for, anyone know? Famous for her hairy legs, and also for highlighting censorship on Instagram, where Instagram will remove pictures of women they don't find pretty enough. And Nigel Rowe would be the final picture, who is suing a Church of England primary school over granting another pupil's request to be accepted as transgender. Nigel believes his own child's rights have been infringed. And on and on and on I could go. As a society, we care a great deal about freedom, don't we? We don't want to impose our views on others, but we really, really don't want others to impose upon us the idea they have of what our roles, goals, or values for life should be. We want to write the script ourselves. That's what we mean by freedom, isn't it? There you go, those are the pictures. Very exciting, wasn't it? If I was going to try and sharpen that definition, BBC World Service can help us. They, in 2014, hosted Freedom Day, and they asked the question, what is it to be free? And here's the definition that emerged from thousands of engagements through social media. Something like this: we are free when we can do or be what we want without external constraints, so long as we don't harm others. And I don't know about you, but it seems to me that achieving this personal freedom is the great concern of our age. It's pretty much the way that we measure whether a society is going in the right direction or not. Is it increasing people's capacity to have personal freedom? And I don't think anyone can question that it has led to, this focus has led to a fairer and more open society, especially for minorities and for women. That's why we care about it. I also don't think there's any doubting that freedom framed this way makes Christianity look bad. If there's anything people think they know about Christianity, it's that it's all about external constraints, and it's all about what God wants, not what we want. And time and again, Christians seem to find themselves on the wrong side of the freedom debate. That was true with those people, those pictures, wasn't it? 3 of them we warmed to, 1 of them we don't. Though all of them thought they were about freedom. The thing is, I think that perception of Christianity is missing something. I think it's based on too simplistic an understanding of what freedom is. So this lunchtime, what I want to do briefly is this. I want to show us why freedom isn't so simple as that definition behind me suggests. And then I want to show us how Jesus takes us beyond it. Not fall short of it, takes us beyond it. Into, if you like, a freer kind of freedom. And I want to try to paint a picture of what that's like. So first then, why freedom isn't so simple. And we can see that it's not so simple if we try and pull apart that definition that I gave us a moment ago. For one thing, what constitutes harm isn't so simple. We don't all agree on it. Hugh Hefner died the other week, didn't he? And I guess we all read his obituaries. We would have read how some people wanted to celebrate a great man who had promoted the freedom of speech through pornography. Meanwhile, other people lamented his objectification of women and damage to relational commitments. And who's to say who's right? Although I wonder if the business with Harvey Weinstein might possibly shed some light on it. But the definition of freedom, as stated above, is meaningless unless we can agree on what harm is. And I think what's happening in our society is that the constant emphasis on individual autonomy is eroding our ability to work these things out together. I was interested to read on Vox.com this week, a gathering at Yale University, make that very point. People today are as moralistic as ever. Our Facebook feeds are full of likes, dislikes, virtue signaling and shaming. We are all pressing upon one another our own beliefs about what is or isn't harmful for other people. But what we aren't being is very self-aware about the whole thing, or living very well together as we do it. And that inevitably leads to a loss of other kinds of freedom, doesn't it? Why is it so difficult? Because what constitutes harm isn't simple. Secondly, the impact of constraints isn't simple either. Not all constraints are negative, if you think about it, in their effect upon us. A pianist, to get any good, has to chain herself to a piano for years and years and years, but there's a wonderful freedom that emerges at the end, isn't there? A rowing ace, if they want to get any good, have to kind of come under the not-so-benign dictatorship of their coach for a couple of terms if they're ever going to get any good. And in the individual sessions, it's not that fun, but at the end of it, if you can get a boat really moving fast through water, it's an extraordinary experience. There's a freedom to that from working together. When a couple fall in love and they start wanting to shape the way they do things around the other person, what do all their friends say? His friends say, oh, she's got him under her thumb, hasn't she? Her friends say, oh, he's making her do all sorts of things she was never into. But to the couple themselves, it feels like freedom. And any relationship of any depth going forward, it is going to require tremendous amounts of sacrifice, tremendous external constraints. But the freedom of love comes no other way. My point is that, yes, there are constraints that tyrannize us, but there are also external constraints that set us free. And often what seems to us initially to be the one can in fact be the other. What seems from the outside to be the one can in fact be the other. What seems from a limited perspective to be the one can, from a perspective that is wider, longer, higher maybe, turn out to be the very opposite. Who is wise enough to know which constraints lead to freedom and which constraints tyrannize? Who's wise enough? Good question. But the impact of constraints isn't simple. And then thirdly, what we want isn't simple either. We don't tend to want just one thing, do we? And often the things we want are at direct odds with one another. Many times there's a difference between what we most want now and what we will have wanted us most to want now in the future, if you think about it. And sometimes the thing that we feel like we most want, even in a very long-term kind of way, is transparently self-destructive for us, all of which means that to describe freedom in terms of getting what we want is grossly simplistic. Let me get concrete. I live in Liverpool. We've got all sorts of people coming to our church there. We've got people who struggle with alcoholism. We've got people who, for various reasons, have major trust issues. We've got people who've been brought up to believe that if they're worth anything, they've got to constantly prove themselves. Now, what is freedom for those people? Is freedom to plonk the alcoholics in the middle of an off-license and say, knock yourselves out? Is freedom to say to those with major trust issues, go on, go ahead, build those walls around you, isolate yourself so that you live and die alone, which is kind of actually what they want? Is freedom for those who feel they've got to prove themselves, to allow them just to go from exam to career, to poor things, forcing it on their children to do the same thing, relentlessly climbing a ladder to nowhere? Is that freedom? Do you see the issue? What do you do when the thing people want, their desires, is the thing that's tyrannizing them? Now, friends, not to get too personal, but that's all of us to some extent. We are all, as C.S. Lewis put it, a zoo of lusts, a bedlam of ambitions, a nursery of fears, a harem of fondled hatreds, all to a greater or lesser extent hurting us. And the obvious question is freedom truly to be given our heart's desire? Or is it to see our desires change? Of course, who can do that for us? That's another good question. All I'm saying here is that what we want isn't simple. So this definition of freedom, it's very familiar to us. But I want to suggest that it does not resolve very much. It actually hides all the interesting questions. Which of our desires are freeing desires? Which of the constraints are freeing constraints? What is harmful to other people? We just can't talk very well about freedom until we've worked out how to talk well about those things, until we've got a richer understanding of the nature of a human being. Now, it's into that context that I want to talk for a few minutes about Jesus Christ and how Jesus offers a freer kind of freedom. Now, it may surprise you to hear this, but in many ways, Jesus' life on earth embodied the modern vision of freedom. Read one of the accounts of his life. You've got one on your table in front of you, and you will see what I mean, how Jesus was never ruled by the people around him. He feared nobody. He was bullied by nobody. He couldn't care less what society thought was normal or acceptable, nor could he be bought or bribed. He did and said what he thought was right with absolute consistency. That's how he led so many people. His freedom reached inside of him too. Jesus was not ruled by a bedlam of desires. He wasn't ruled by guilt or hurt or pride or ego. And his freedom reached far and wide also. He was not ruled even by nature. No, with a touch he could heal the sick. With a word he could calm storms. He even rose from the dead himself. The Jesus presented to us in the Bible is a Jesus who was gloriously, profoundly free. Not selfish free, not contrary, not pointlessly rebellious, not chippily with a point to prove, not always following some sort of campaign he has to pursue, just free, without baggage, free in a way we'd love to be. And with that in mind, I want us to look at this promise that he makes. You can see it there behind me. It's from a passage in John's Gospel, which you've got in front of you. The passage is all about this issue of freedom, and I would encourage you to read it yourself later if you want to see that what I'm saying is roughly in line with what Jesus himself says. You can take that away with you at the end if you want, but you can see the promise. If the Son sets you free, you'll be free indeed. He's referring to himself when he says the Son, but notice how he defines himself in terms of a relationship, and indeed he defines freedom in terms of a relationship. How's that interesting? Let's go back to our definition of freedom. We want to say we're free when we can do or be what we want without external constraints, so long as we don't harm others. Where do other people fit in there? They fit in only as a problem with their external constraints, or as a concession, or so long as we don't harm others. Nothing more ambitious than that. Jesus just doesn't see it that way. According to the Bible, the way true freedom is found is not despite relationships, it's through them, in them. In a word, the ultimate freedom is love. It's to know and be known. It's to love and be loved. It's to live well. That's what we're on this planet for. And Jesus' claim is that he enables us to be free like that to a greater extent than anyone else can. Now, to make sense of that claim, I want to place it briefly in the wider story of the Bible. The Bible says that God made this world for him to know us and us to know him in community, for him to love us and us in community to love him. And yes, the way he designed things, there were constraints, his laws. But we've seen already that that's not necessarily the enemy of freedom. The issue is what effects in the long run do those constraints have? And God's laws were always liberating. When God told us to forgive, for instance, he wasn't being mean. He knew that in the short run, being told to forgive feels like slavery, and what we want to do is to be free to carry that grudge with us. But what he knows is that in the long run, bitterness is a terrible slavery, and peace is a beautiful freedom. He knew where to place the boundaries. He's the only one who does. The tragedy of humanity is that though he made us and loves us, we won't trust him. All of us naturally think of freedom as freedom away from him rather than freedom with him. It's the most self-destructive attitude we could possibly have adopted. Because the moment we took ourselves out of relationship with him, our desires went all over the place. And they are now what we are mastered by. We're not free. We're mastered by our backgrounds, our habits, our longings, our lusts, our regrets, our fears, our anger, by things that lie deep within us that we ourselves seem to be able to do little about, and certainly society around us can do nothing more than to leave us to it. Knock yourself out. And these haywire desires in the end destroy us. That's why Jesus came. The Son who was God, the Son who was himself gloriously free, used his freedom to come into this world, to live the life of trust that we should have lived, and then to die on the cross to bear the consequences of our refusal to trust God. All this he did so that we could be forgiven and freed from sin and evil and death to be restored to God. He made the first move. We've thought already, haven't we, how every relationship requires sacrifice, requires a willingness to be constrained. Perhaps you sense that if you were to get serious about Jesus, there'd be constraints, there'd be all these laws. Well, there will be. But he was constrained first. To nails, no less. On this cross, the Son became a slave so that we who were slaves could enjoy the freedom of knowing and being known, loving and being loved in community with God as sons and daughters. He came for us. That's why we trust him. And then he rose again because death couldn't hold him, and he lives today, and he promises to all who trust in him that he will give them his Spirit to live in them, to begin to get to grips with those things that trap us from within. And then finally he will return to free us perfectly by bringing us into a world that's freed from the curse it fell under. What is the freedom then that Jesus Christ brings as I wrap up? It's the freedom to live as he did. Not constrained by what everyone else thinks of us or the plans they've laid out for us. Not chained to guilt over the past or dominated by fear for the future. Not pressured to conform to what a Cambridge graduate is supposed to do, as if that was worthy of dominating our lives from here on, but instead free to be the people that God made us to be. Launched like ships into the ocean, each of us to sail our own course. You know, God's not short on creativity. That's our problem. When humans freeze water, what do we make? We make ice cubes, every one a clone of the others. When God freezes water, what does he make? He makes snowflakes. And just as God has given each of us our own fingerprint, so as we trust Jesus and are led by him, we are led into a glorious individuality. The right constraints, increasingly the right desires, and not with the ambition of merely not harming anyone else, but rather that we might love God and love others as he does. Like I say, it's not that Jesus falls short of our society's definition of freedom. It's just that he goes a long, long way beyond it. Well, I'm going to get off my perch now. You've been very good at listening. Thank you very much. I think we've got a couple of minutes now just to chat about around our tables, and you can tell me all the things I've got wrong. But there's a text number to send in questions or comments if you want to. Thanks. Over to you.
Great, sorry to break in there. I'm going to invite Brian back up, and we're going to have some time for questions now, so do keep texting in any questions you've had that have come up when you've been chatting in your tables. Would anyone like to kick us off with a question from the floor? So Stephen's going round. Great, yeah, just wait for the mic, it's just coming.
Just coming. You've got to be very nice to me. I've got 3 very small children who have not mastered the night, so if I'm a bit dopey, be kind. Okay.
I was just wondering, you mentioned about the difference between freeing constraints and sort of maybe like tyrannical constraints. But I'm just wondering, the examples you gave, so for example, a pianist, working many hours a day, piano, or 2 people in a relationship making compromise to satisfy each other. Could it be that under the original definition, they weren't really external constraints? Because, if you forced like a small child to practice 6 hours of piano, even if they don't really want to play on the piano, you could maybe say that's okay in the long run, but that's like be better, give them something good in the long run. But that's definitely not kind of freedom. Whereas if you have a person who really wants to play the piano and dedicates themselves, then it's kind of more of a personal choice. Excellent. So I'm just wondering, but then maybe because you don't get to have like discussion with God about which laws about you think they should apply, could it be that the examples you gave are sort of weren't really external constraints, whereas perhaps ones laid down by God are, and so...
Thank you for the question. I think I understand it. What I tried to do is to move through the gears with that. So with the pianist, you're absolutely right, the pianist is choosing to do something. With the rowing aid, I think it's more subtle, isn't it? Because when I rowed very, very badly, my recollection was that what do you need? 9 or 10 people, effectively, to have a decent training session. There was always one where you had to get out of bed. Is it the same with you? And when you got them out of bed, they weren't like, yippee, thank you so much, this is my choice. It was like, you committed to this. You're going to come, because you're kind of screwing the rest of us if you don't, right? It was a kind of external constraint at the time. It certainly felt like that. In a relationship, it very much feels like that. And there are times in any significant relationship where you are thinking, I am doing this purely because the other person wants me to. But there's a deeper sense in which, no, but I want to please that person, right? That's what we've got going on with God. When you come into a relationship with God through the Lord Jesus Christ, what was an external constraint becomes internalized because you love the person who's speaking to you. And so there's a place in the New Testament where the writer talks about God's laws being written, not as a sort of rule book you have to follow, but written on our hearts. So we want to follow. In a sense, we're free to do what we want, but what we want changes. Okay? Although there's a subtlety to that process, as there is with other constraints. That was a long answer, wasn't it?
Okay.
Sorry.
Do you want to come back on that, or you... Great. Any other question from the floor? Okay, so a question from me about your personal experience. So how, in your experience, has Jesus set you free?
Thanks. I think for me, I love people's approval. I like to be well thought of. I enjoy praise. And that's not a terribly unhealthy thing, although if that desire gets too big in my heart, that becomes an awful tyranny, because it's like Judgment Day every day, isn't it? What do people think? What do people think? What do people think? Now, coming into a relationship with Jesus has been very helpful for me, because what I get from God is his approval from day one. He says, because Jesus lived and died in your place, I look at you and I couldn't be more pleased with you. I'm proud of you. And I've already got that, so to speak, in the bank, no matter how I perform. And having that great judgment day settled, if you like, frees me from 10,000 intermediary judgment days. And so there's a freedom that comes from his promises.
Thank you. And then what about other faiths? Is it possible that other faiths could offer freedom like this? Is Jesus unique in this claim?
I think there are, I wouldn't quite want to say in our experience freedom is a totally binary thing. And I can certainly see how people might find in other faith systems, my experience is, this is freeing me. In the bigger picture, I think I would want to ask the questions, can this faith system deal with the issues of sin, evil, and death? So if I put my trust in this, can this free me from the consequences of my rebellion against God so that I will live with him forever? It's a whole other issue, isn't it? And internally, can this faith system change me from within? Is it a living thing? And again, that's probably outside the scope of this talk.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any more questions from the floor? Any more to text in? Great, I think we'll call that a day. Thank you so much, Brian. And there's really no rush to head off. There'll be snacks coming out to you at your tables. So those discussions that you started earlier, do carry them on. And Brian will be here afterwards as well. So if you want to maybe ask him a question and have a chat more normally, then he'd love to do that. So he'll be around here. We'd really like to know what you thought of the event. So on your table, you'll see some feedback cards. Let us know what you enjoyed. Let us know how we can make it better. And if you'd like to chat more about this or any other question you may have, just tick the I'm interested box and someone from the Christian Union will get in touch with you. We're going to be here next week, again, same place, same time, looking at the issue of suffering. So if God is good, why is the world so bad? Before that, we're going to be hosting discussion groups in lots of different colleges. So this week, looking at whether we're free to fail. So this freedom we've been talking about today, does that even apply to the times when we feel we've messed up? Does that apply when it comes to success and failure? So grab one of these flyers, they're on your tables. Check out the details for your specific college. It'd be great to see you there. Also, as you leave, there's a table at the back with some books that will help you think more about this and other issues. So if you want to look more at Jesus and his claims and get a richer understanding of what we're looking at from John and the account of his life, there's this book called Real Life Jesus. And if you want to think more generally about issues like freedom, this is a great book by Timothy Keller called Making Sense of God. So those books are free for you to take away. We'd love for you to make the most of that if that would be helpful for you. Great. Have a really great afternoon and hopefully see you next week.